Good afternoon, and welcome to the 8th Annual Don Rix Distinguished Keynote Address. I'm Pascal Spott-Helfer, and I have the pleasure to serve as the President and CEO of Genome BC. I would like to start by acknowledging that we're gathering on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people who have looked after this glorious land for thousands of years. I would also like to especially welcome the many students from Gladstone Secondary School in our audience today. You not only bring a youthful energy here, but you're also the ones best positioned to convert the learnings from Sharon's story into action. I'm sure you will all be even more empowered by recognizing one person can make a huge difference personally, locally, and globally. Many of you will know that Genome BC is committed to support cutting-edge genomics research and applications across all sectors in BC. In addition, we're equally committed to ensure this research spans societal implications of genomics and affords our community members an opportunity for dialogue, input, and reflection. In the context of genomics and society, tonight's speaker is an exceptional example of the power of citizen science at work. She has literally changed the world, and we're delighted to be hosting Sharon Terry today. Before we get started, there are just a few things to know about today's program. After the keynote address, our Chief Scientific Officer and VP Sectors, Dr. Carolina Lopez Correa, will hold a Q&A of about 20 minutes with our speaker. We encourage you to be engaged in this talk, and instead of bungling up the details on how, please check the screens behind me. Slido.com is an online polling system, and DRTK is the event code. This information will be on the screen during the talk as well. You can also participate in the social conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag DRTK2017. And again, this is up on the screen behind me. Followed our distinguished speaker, you're welcome to join us for a reception just outside these doors at the back in the mezzanine, where I'm sure that the engaged conversations will continue. And now, as is the tradition, I would like to take a moment to talk a little bit about the man for whom this event is named, Dr. Don Rix. Don was one of the co-founders of Genome BC and served as our board chair in the formative years. He was an innovator and a philanthropist with a broad palette of interests: medicine and science, education and the arts. As a physician and healer, Don saw the need in the practice for better diagnostics and founded a system of clinical labs which are now known as Life Labs across Canada. It was then Michael Smith, UBC's 1993 Nobel laureate, who convinced Don that genomics would be critical for the future of biology and medicine. And as a result, Don took a keen interest in genomics, and his influence on the development of Genome BC is still felt today. He was truly a visionary and a pioneer. In fact, BC's biotech industry wouldn't be anywhere near what it is today if it hadn't been for Don's belief in the possibilities that genomics had to offer society. Don was a great entrepreneur, a committed angel investor, and a generous and effective donor to many causes. Where others saw problems, he saw opportunity. Don's passionate, constructive contribution to every organization he was involved in was and still is an inspiration. Throughout his life, he looked for gaps and for opportunities to fill it. What he wanted to do most was to make a difference, and did he ever. When we lost Don in 2009, Genome BC decided that one way we could recognize his legacy was to establish this annual Distinguished Keynote Address as a way to continue inspiring our community. I think that Don would highly approve of our keynote today. Sharon Terry promises not only to inspire us, but to challenge our understanding of genomics, the implications to modern society, and our role as citizens in scientific discovery, progress, and applications. Finally, I would like to thank Sally Greenwood, our VP Communications and Societal Engagement, and her team for organizing today's event, including the roundtables leading up to it. This takes a tremendous effort, and as usual, Sally and her collaborators have executed flawlessly. Thank you very much. So now I would like to ask Carolina to come up and introduce this year's Don Rix Distinguished Keynote Speaker. Carolina.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure to introduce Sharon Terry today. It's actually the second time I have the pleasure to introduce Sharon. The first time was in Quebec in 2010 for a very small gathering that we had on precision medicine. Funny enough, at the time, we were in the middle of a Genome Canada competition on precision health. And guess what? Today, 2017, I am introducing Sharon for the second time. We're in the middle of a competition with Genome Canada in precision health. So I think we have to, we're good at coordinating your visits in any case. But so Sharon, as many of you have seen in her bio, we will not go through all the details because there's a lot to tell, and she will tell us a little bit. But she's now the president and CEO of Genetic Alliance. Is a network of more than 10,000 organizations around the world, starting from maybe a small group to now a huge organization. She's the founding CEO of PXE International. It's a research advocacy organization for the genetic condition pseudoxanthoma elasticum, and I don't think I'm going to ask you at the end to repeat it, but if you can, that'll be great. It's PXE, which affects Sharon's two kids, or two grown children, that she'll tell us about a little bit. And Sharon, through that experience, has taken citizen science to really the next level. And again, she will show us some examples, but she went from not being a scientist at all, not speaking the science language or even taking a biology course, into going to discover the PXE gene, developing a diagnostic test, patenting the gene, making that available to many people, doing clinical trials. And I'm not going to tell you more because otherwise I'll take your talk. But anyway, she has really done a great job in that space of citizen science. And she has taken citizen science to a national and international level, really to the next level. She has worked with many different organizations in developing participant-centric pathways for ordinary people to transform medical research and to transform healthcare. She serves in the leadership positions and advisory positions in many different organizations like Precision Medicine Initiative in Washington, the National Academy of Medicine, and many others. And her work has focused on productively disrupting research and influencing policy. Sharon led the coalition that fought for the passage of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, the GINA Act, in the USA, and has advised also Canada in our path to pass a bill also in non-discrimination in Canada. So Genome BC is very, very proud today to present Sharon Terry to the Vancouver community. This will be her first major keynote talk after the tech talk she did in November last year entitled "Science Didn't Understand My Kids' Rare Diseases Until I Decided to Study It." That TED Talk has been viewed by more than 1 million people around the world, which is amazing. There are many great talks, so it's an honor for us to have Sharon Terry today, and I ask you to join me in welcome Sharon Terry today.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It is a tremendous honor to stand on this stage, both because I very much love Genome BC for quite some time. I tell the story that my husband and I came here on our honeymoon, and we tried to move to Canada. And the Canadian authorities told us that we were ordinary Americans and we should go back to the U.S. So we didn't move here, but I do love visiting. And thank you very much for hosting me over these few days. So my title today is, If You Are Not at the Table, You Are on the Menu. And I think that's true about a lot of things in life. So I hope that through this experience that we'll have today over the next half hour or so, we can get a sense of that together. This is going to be pretty interactive in the sense that I am going to tell you a story, my story, but not because my story is so critical for you to know, but instead for you to find what of this story resonates for you and where is it that you can make change, that we can make change together. So we're first going to take some polls, and you remember that you needed to get this app on your phone. I'm hoping lots of people did. And the first thing we're going to ask is, do you consider yourself primarily, and there's a whole bunch of categories here, and you may overlap, but I just want you to put the one that you are primarily a member of. And we'll wait just a minute or two so that people can vote. And you can see the ticker in the top there. We've got 20 and 34 people voting, equal numbers of students and researchers. Students are going to outnumber everybody because they put the app on their phone quickly, I think. And we'll just give this another minute or so. Interested members of public are coming alive. And there's citizen scientists here, great. Advocates. Few research participants, interesting, not a lot of us. And policymakers. Great. Good. All right, so about a third of you are students, about a third are researchers, and a third are interested members of the public, and then several other categories. And the students and researchers kept flipping percentages. Okay, let's go to the next question. So the next question I want to ask you is, who owns your health data? And again, you might think more than one of these categories does, but primarily, who owns your health data? Catching on, going much faster this time. We're going to hit 100 quickly. Great. So we have about 50% of the audience believing it is that you own your health data, about a quarter thinking the doctor, and then health institution and the government coming in underneath those two. Great. Okay, next question. This is the last question for now. Who should have access to your health data? And again, you might believe all these categories, but go with the one that you think should first or most primarily have access. Again, quickly and really high for obviously you. I say obviously because that's where I come down, but certainly others are also seeing in other places. Okay, so we get a sense of how you see the world right now. At the end of this, we're going to have a few more questions. They won't be things like, can you say pseudoxanthoma elasticum? And they won't be a quiz on my talk, but some more things about yourself, actually. So we can go back to my slides. Thank you. So I want to tell you why I'm here, why I'm showing up this way. And I am doing this because it is very personal. And Catalina told you a little bit about this at the beginning. So Elizabeth and Ian, my two children, are pictured here Christmas of 1994. And for quite a few months, actually a couple years, I had noticed a rash on the sides of Elizabeth's neck. And the rash was disturbing to me. And I asked our doctor several times, what is this rash on her neck? And I was told that I was probably worried about health and disease. My father and brother had died in the last 9 months, both of different kinds of cancers, and the doctor just thought, you just are too concerned, not really as calm as you should be, and you should actually put yourself in therapy, which I did, and I'm glad I did. But I did still worry about, why is this rash just on the sides? Why isn't it all the way around? Why is it 3 dots in the first year and 6 dots 6 months later and 9 dots a few months after that? And so I took my daughter to a dermatologist. And in the US, if your doctor doesn't allow you to go to another specialist, you have to pay. So I paid out of pocket for a dermatologist to look at Elizabeth. And it's 2 days before Christmas, 1994. And the doctor takes one look at Elizabeth and says, she has pseudoxanthoma elasticum, And my stomach just dropped because I heard OMA, which comes in a lot of cancers, lymphoma, melanoma, and thought, wow, we went from a moment ago a healthy child to a child who could have cancer or something. The doctor, who's a dermatologist, turned off the lights and looked in her eyes and said, yep, I see signs in her eyes. And I was even more traumatized. I said, it's a skin thing. Why is he looking in her eyes? What could this possibly mean? How does he know? What are you trying to tell me? He turned the lights back on, and then he just glanced at my son and said, he has it too. So we went from being an ordinary family with 2 ordinary kids to this traumatic, dramatic diagnosis. The doctor, Lionel Berkovich, told us everything he could tell us, the kids and me, and the kids at this point are 5 and 7 years old, everything he could tell us about the disease, which was almost nothing. There were signs in the eyes that could lead to blindness around age 20 or 30. There was skin that would get lax and sagging like they were 90 years old when they were 20. There would be arterial and cardiovascular problems. And I was just stunned. My kids had the best Christmas of their lives. They didn't understand why we bought them every single toy they wanted, while my husband and I lived with terror that Christmas. Some of the literature even said that they would die around 30. It turned out this neighbor, this dermatologist was our neighbor. He lived down the street. We didn't know that. And he spent Christmas Eve with us, telling us as much as he could, which again wasn't much. About 2 days after Christmas, 2 researchers came from a university in Boston and took our kids' blood, telling us they were going to look for the gene. And they took our blood, and we were excited and happy that they wanted to look for the gene for this disease, because we were quickly learning nobody knew too much about it. 2 days after that, 2 more researchers showed up and wanted blood from my kids. And we said, these are just children. How could you think that you're going to take blood from children again? You need to go to those other researchers and get blood from them. And it was then that we learned that researchers didn't share. We were shocked. We were so shocked that this system is designed actually to reward competition rather than to alleviate suffering. I'm still stunned by that 24 years later, and I still see signs of that throughout the biomedical research system, something that I cannot comprehend to this day. We were just ordinary parents. I have a master's in religious studies. I was going to be a pastoral counselor when the kids came along, and I homeschooled them. My husband was a construction manager, built fire protection systems in buildings in Boston, the hospitals primarily. So neither of us had any background to decide that we were going to do something about this, but we knew that we had to. We knew that as far as we could tell, there wasn't anything known about this disease. We went to the libraries near us, the medical school libraries, and quickly learned you had to pay to get into the medical school library, $25 every time you wanted to go in the Countway Library at Harvard. So we learned how to tailgate students into the library so that we could get the articles we needed. We copied everything we could find on the disease, about 400 papers. In those days, there was something called the Internet Grateful Med instead of PubMed, and you could look up articles, but you couldn't get them. So we brought those all home, and we tried to read them, and we realized we didn't understand a single thing. As my husband was fond of saying, we didn't know a gene from a hubcap. Same thing for us. So we essentially decided that despite the major barrier of us not having the background we needed, we were going to have to take the biomedical world by storm. And the second problem we had was that many people told us, you can't herd cats. Getting scientists to share is like herding cats. And we said, yes, you can if you move the food. The food for these scientists was clearly blood and tissue and clinical information, and we could do something about that. So my husband and I essentially began to look at how can we find people with no internet. Remember, we can't just post on Facebook in 1994, 95. Instead, how do we find people with this disease? So we decided if we put a calendar item in every newspaper in the United States and Canada and say, we're having a meeting for people with PXE, then we will find people. We're not really having a meeting in every city in the United States and Canada, but people did call us and say, you're having a meeting? And we're saying, no, we're not having a meeting, but we wanted to find you, and this was a cheap way of finding you. You don't have to pay to put a calendar item in the newspaper. So we eventually gathered about 100, 150 people, and then we decided we need their blood, so we started to gather their blood. Our kids at one point said, you know, Mom, so much blood and ovaries next to the ice cream in the freezer is really not very good. And we quickly worked with labs to be able to store it in places that were, of course, more certified and all that sort of stuff. So we put together a research program in our own bumbling, stumbling way. My husband drew this diagram about 5 days after the kids were diagnosed, and it looks like a plumbing diagram, because that's what he knew. And it's even the old blue that we used to use for the early PowerPoint slides, because it's a really old slide. And it actually has stood us well as a map, as a way of getting through this maze. And those of you from Gladstone will know that, yes, actually this is not a bad setup to kind of go from a gene to a therapy or a treatment. We established PXE International, which is a research foundation for the disease. Again, just bringing together these people from all over the world. At first, only a couple hundred, and then eventually at this point we have almost 5,000. With the couple hundred, we were able to start to do genetic research, but we needed a place to do it. While we could store blood and tissue in our freezer at home, we didn't have the setup to extract DNA and run gels and that sort of stuff. So we went to a lab at Harvard and borrowed bench space at night, and a nice neighbor took care of our kids while my husband and I worked at night to do that. Here's our biobank on our desk in our kids' old playroom. Essentially mailing out tubes to people who would then go find somebody to draw their blood and send it back to us so we could store it and eventually extract the DNA. You'll see an Apple II SE here on the desk. And behind that, what did they call those old globy things? I don't even remember. iMac or something like that. Yeah, so that was the beginning. And then CDs, lots of CDs with images and things like that on it. So very homegrown, totally. Our kids and we traveled all over Europe and South Africa because we needed more than just US and Canada. You see them here in a motorhome. They were homeschooled. You can see the face of Elizabeth like she's semi-interested in this homeschooling, and Ian who's saying, why do I have to do this stuff? And then them watching a movie on one of the first old Apple laptops. They went with us as we traveled around looking for people to participate in our studies. We created a t-shirt that said PXE means never having to say pseudoxanthoma elasticum, because lots of people had trouble with this word. Elizabeth testified before the US Congress when she was about 10 years old. Again, you can see Ian's not too interested in the Congress people. Elizabeth is giving them her testimony that she wrote by herself. We created ways to raise money. So in this case, Ian is going to swim the triathlon leg for us. We put up signs in cities. This one is in Boston for the Electrical Brotherhood. And we, again, went to labs and worked with researchers as much as we could. We did get researchers to share because we brought all of this blood and tissue together. And we said, if you want this, then you have to share and not only give results to yourselves in papers and publications, but also you must share with other researchers and with the people who gave you this blood. We put up a website finally. This one was hosted by Harvard. You can see the very long URL perhaps in 1996. And again, very rudimentary stuff compared to today. We finally did find the gene in 1999. And we were the first lay people to find a gene. And we published with 2 research groups that were working with us by then, back-to-back papers in Nature Genetics. And at the time, it was my first 2 papers, and I thought somebody with a master's in religious studies publishing in Nature Genetics back-to-back is pretty good. We eventually realized, very quickly actually, around 1997 or so, a few years later, that we should not be doing this alone. we should, in fact, be figuring out how to do it with lots of others. That doing this for one disease was not going to change the world or change the disease, actually. And so we joined with Genetic Alliance that Catalina told you a little bit about, a coalition of groups working together. And not just working on the research side, but also working on the policy side. So here you can see a group of people who've come to Washington, D.C. at this point to lobby the Congress for the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So again, another place that I have no business. I don't know how a bill becomes a law at that point. And I know there's those cartoons you can watch, so I try to find one, because I saw one, I'm sure, in 6th grade. But I don't know those kinds of things. And I am going before the members of Congress basically saying, we need to change how things are done. We need protections. We need data sharing. We need a lot of policy changes. The picture there of my husband, this is in 1996 with Francis Collins, who at that point is the guy in charge of the sequencing of the human genome, was a funny kind of coincidence as well. So we met Francis at the Genetic Alliance's 10th anniversary. Genetic Alliance just had its 30th anniversary. And Francis gave a keynote there. I know that he's been here before as well, and he's a really good speaker and stuff. And I emailed him, and he allows me to tell this story. I emailed him right after and said, Dr. Collins, would you come and give our first keynote at our PXE meeting? Now, there are 7,000 rare diseases and lots of common ones, so you can imagine that, no, he can't give a talk at every one of these small groups. He emails back, Dear Pam, don't tell Sharon, but I'm going skiing with Diane, his then girlfriend, now wife. And I send it back to him and say, Dr. Collins, I think this was not intended for me. And he emails back and says, I will do your keynote. So Dr. Collins did our keynote, and Evermore was a friend of both Genetic Alliance and PXE International, and really a champion for people and for people centricity and this sort of thing. And I became the president and CEO of Genetic Alliance about 14 years ago, realizing that it was important for me to move up and out of this place that I was in. All this time, though, fear was breathing down my neck. Fear about my kids and their health and their future. Fear that I was not adequate enough to be with the researchers I was with, that I didn't have the kind of credentials they did, and that I was inadequate in this situation. And fear that we weren't going to be able to change the system the way I think we needed to. And that fear was pretty strong and pretty overwhelming. It was built on top of two secrets that I started to understand at the time or suss out. And the first is there are no ready answers for people like my kids. And by that, I don't mean just my kids. I mean most rare diseases. I even mean a lot of common diseases. We don't have the answer for a lot of things. Mental health conditions, addiction, all kinds of things that we humans suffer from, we don't have the answers for. And the second secret is that the answers are in all of us, in our biological information, in our sharing data, and ultimately by sharing ourselves. And that's going to be the most important thing for me, is that we do have these answers, and we're still not quite ready to unlock them. There are some people who are making efforts in this regard, some of them citizen scientists, and I'm going to show you two of them. One of them is Dana Lewis, who made an artificial pancreas. Dana took her continuous glucose monitoring device and her insulin pump and had them talk to each other, because she kept not waking up in the night when her alarms went off with her diabetes, and really was frightened that something serious would happen, particularly as she moved away to college and beyond. And so working in her garage with another hacker who is now her husband, makes a device that now several hundred people are testing, and FDA has given preliminary approval to go ahead with clinical trials for. All by herself, because this was a need and she could do it. Another guy who's a Canadian, Stephen Keating, was an MIT student in, I don't know what, engineering or something. Stephen will probably be sorry that I don't remember. But he had needed some money and went and had a brain scan. You know, $25 or whatever. They were doing some machine retooling, and didn't even think about it. Got the scan, went home, back to college, and so on. About 2 or 3 years later, he's noticing that he's constantly smelling vinegar when no one else is smelling vinegar, and he looks up that the part of the brain that senses smell is in a certain place, and he takes out the old scan, and he sees an anomaly on his old scan. He's an engineering student. And he goes back to them and says, I see this anomaly, let's do another scan, and they did, and he had a massive brain tumor, an astrocytoma. In his hand there, he's holding a 3D model of his brain tumor. The surgery was done while he was awake, which he videotaped and talks about in lots of talks. And the reason he talks about it, and the reason he did this and made Christmas tree ornaments for his family of his brain tumor, is because when he went and said, I want the data from the surgery and all that, they said, you can't have it. It's not yours and you can't have it. So he enrolled in Harvard Med School for a year in order to get the data, because as a student he could get it. So Stephen broke this down in a whole different way. He now works for Apple making healthcare products. With this enormous fear coming to me, I had to say, what is this fear about? Why is this fear so almost debilitating for me, even though I'm still moving through all these different pieces? And there was a point where my children just stopped me in my tracks. They were just before they were entering their teens, and several of us were having dinner. And these two said, when you stop fighting disease and you start living with it the way we do, you will make a difference. And as a parent, that was an incredible thing to hear from one's children. These kids have led me all the way as I move through the different pieces that I need to move through, and have taught me a great deal. Lots of people like to know where they are today, and so in the upper left-hand corner, Elizabeth and her wife, Erin, are in grad school, Elizabeth for an MBA, and Erin is doing a master's in forensic biology. I texted her just before I came in here to tell her you guys were interested in that and working in that as well, and she was like, yes, awesome. So George Washington University has a good master's program. And Ian is expecting a baby in December with his wife, Michelle. And the two kids would tell you that they're healthy and happy despite the fact that they have all the manifestations of the disease. When I think about that fear and how much in a way this fear motivates me, I also had to really look deeply into this fear and say, what is it that stops me from moving forward? How is it that I'm not showing up in one way or another? And I learned through help from a lot of colleagues, a lot of people journeying with me, to actually turn toward my fear, to step into my fear, and in doing so, step into the shoes of other people I fear, people who fear me, misunderstandings and miscommunications between me and others. And that has given me, I think, more ability, more capacity, more power than anything else that I've done in this field. Understanding that when I get that twinge of, do I want to walk in this room and challenge this researcher? Do I want to ask the government why we're funding and not requiring data sharing? Do I want to make this statement that might disrupt this place? I go back to, can I turn with gentle curiosity toward this fear and really show up toward what I need to be facing? That, for me, has been absolutely transformational. I think if we are open to breathing into our fear, to turning toward it, to showing up for it, then our power as change makers grows exponentially. That every time we get that kind of flicker, that I'm uncomfortable saying this, I don't think I'll be well received. I think somebody will be challenging me in a way that I won't be able to take. I think somebody won't take me seriously. All those things, to me, are places for me to turn into and turn toward in a way that I hope opens in me new ways of seeing, new ways of being. In this process, I've realized that working on my inner life is working on my outer life, and outer work is inner work. And that this work of coming to know who I am, of being challenged, of not wanting to be on the menu but at the table, of bringing myself to the table in ways that I think have been generative and important, has only happened because of an internal transformation. And that transformation was beginning in small ways to break down the us versus them. So my real anger at the beginning that those researchers are not sharing. Those researchers only care about their career, about their papers, about their promotions. I started to realize I have to ask, if I'm going to ask them to risk their careers, their promotions, their publications, I have to risk too. I have to say, how is it true about me that I'm not sharing, that I'm building silos, that I'm not being open as I can be? And by asking that question and stepping into the shoes of the other person, I can see all the places that we do align, all the things that we do want. And while sometimes our motivations are different, sometimes our incentives are different, I can find the place where we do overlap and where I understand the difference that's important and the sameness that's important. And so for me, risking asking them means risking myself and risking how I come to the world and how I face it. And so for me, this inner work absolutely has influenced my outer work, and my outer work influenced my inner work, because I think there is no limit to what we can do together if we move together. Thank you. And we're going to have another poll, and then we're actually going to have an exercise, because this is all about you, actually. And so I want to bring to you some of what I've learned. So our first poll, I want you to answer, my greatest fear when I think about standing up for myself, my idea, or my cause is, and then I give you several choices there. And again, I know many of these might apply, but just, oh, in this case, you can check all that apply, yes. And so the one that's leading right now is feeling like I might not be right, and also feeling like I'm not capable or enough. That's a question I asked myself a lot in this process is, am I enough? And discovering that, yep, I am, and so are every single one of us, because we're all, at the core, our own expert, and we're all filled with capacity. And then feeling like I won't be heard, being criticized, not taken seriously, disappointing myself or others, and risk disturbing the status quo. Last one, so quite a few people are rabble-rousers here. That's great. Can we go to the next question? So my greatest strength when I think about standing up for myself, my idea, or a cause is, so what's your greatest strength? Believing in the cause, not afraid of being alone in your cause, ability to see the obvious, others believing and supporting you. Lots of passionate people here believing in the cause is leading. Great. And the last question? I want you to think about the ways that you support yourself. Quiet time, meditation, exercise, mindful eating, mindful listening to others. So a lot of quiet time. That's good. Exercise equal, listening, mindful eating, meditation. Great. Okay, back to my slides. Okay, we're going to engage in an exercise that I'm going to invite you to. Some of you might find this challenging. You might be afraid of it. You might be thinking it's silly. But I'm going to invite you to go for it. And it's pretty simple, but it has a couple of kind of parameters that make it more useful in an exercise. The person that I learned this from, a person named Chris Price, who does Gestalt awareness practice with a group called Tribal Ground, always describes this essentially as going to the gym. That when we go to the gym, we work a muscle. And we work that muscle for a reason so that later on when we either lift something or are doing something, that muscle works well. And so this exercise is going to be working a muscle, which means it's exaggerated the same way in the gym we exaggerate a movement. And this time that we're going to do here is going to be a total of about 15 minutes, maybe 13 minutes. And it's a time for you to be listened to by someone else for a short, very short time with no interference from the listener. In this time, anything goes. Silence, words, gestures, nonsense. And you may encounter a fear, so as an experiment, I'm going to ask you to go with it. So we're going to use this question, but don't worry about it yet. Essentially, tell me what supports you, and this is how we're going to use the question. This is called repeating inquiry, and one person is going to be a listener, and the other person is going to be the speaker, and then people will switch after 5 minutes. The listener is going to ask the question with no special emphasis. So the listener is going to ask, I'm going to pretend I'm doing it with Sally. Sally, tell me what supports you. And Sally will have told me which one of these she likes the best. Which one do you like the best, Sally?
In being myself.
Okay, so I would just say, Sally, tell me what supports you in being yourself. And then I, as a listener, I'm going to be quiet. I am not going to talk, which might be one of the most challenging things you will do today. But we're going to invite you to be silent. I'm also not going to react to Sally. Because what we realize is a lot of our listening is actually inserting ourselves. And I'm going to not insert myself. I'm not going to react. I'm not going to not smile, nod, say, yeah, me too, even though I'm having that experience. So I'll notice my experience, but I'm not going to give it to Sally because I'm going to give Sally the space, the time to be just to herself and to have me be that attentive to her, an experience we often don't have. The next part of this is that the speaker, so in this case I'm just going to keep using Sally because it's easy, the speaker will say whatever comes to their mind. So it may not even make sense. It might be a thought that just came in like, my daughter just had tooth surgery. I wonder how she is. And she can say that out loud or not. This whole time could be silent. This time could have words. This time could have gestures. She will say whatever she comes to her. So again, a time just to be. There's no expectation. How often do we get the luxury of no expectation? No right answer, no wrong answer, nothing. And then after, and you're also not performing for the listener. So the listener is on their own. This is your time. And then the listener, after an obvious pause, and Sally might nod or just be quiet, the listener, I would say, thank you. And then I would repeat the question again for the 5-minute period. Now, I might say it once to her because she is going with it. I might say it 2 or 3 times to her. That doesn't matter. So the idea is that I am going to give my 100% support to Sally in a way that she doesn't normally get because I'm going to listen deeply. I'm also going to notice what's happening with me, so I'm not 100% focused on her. And then she gets to say whatever arises in her. This is an experiment, and we really want you to try it this way. I know that some of you may say, but I do want to talk back, and I haven't met this person before, and it'd be great to... Yes, and we have a reception after, and there'll be great time for all this kind of conversation. But I want us to try this experiment, and I think the reasons for it will become quite clear afterward. So what I want you to do is to pick a partner, and you may have to hop over a seat or something, and we may even have to move a few people around. But right now, identify someone you will do this with, so that I'm sure everybody has a person. Okay, if you don't have a partner, could you raise your hand so that you can pair with each other, the people who don't have partners? Everybody has a partner? You won't want to miss this. You at least want to try it. Okay. All right. Sally, I need my phone, if you don't mind bringing, because I'm going to time us. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to put the questions back up. Now, pick who's going to be the speaker first. Does everybody know who's the speaker first? Okay. And then speaker, tell the listener which one of these 3 you want. How do you want the listener to ask you? Tell me what supports you, and then tell your partner what you want to be asked. Okay, does everybody have that? All right, I'm going to ring a timer. There will be 3 bells. And at the end of 5 minutes, there'll be 3 more bells. And in between, as I said, speaker, relax. Relax. You can talk, not talk, make gestures, whatever you want. Give your listener a little indication that you're ready for them to say, thank you, and ask the question again. And if that doesn't happen in the 5 minutes, no problem. Nothing is a problem. There's nowhere to go and no special way to be right now. All right, we're going to begin with a bell. And listener, no speaking. Reminder that listener, you're not speaking. That's part of the exercise. And right now, maybe everybody, we're about halfway through, just take a minute and a couple of breaths to see what are you noticing right now about how this feels, whether you're speaker or listener. And then speaker, when you're ready, go ahead and continue. Okay, so some of you are saying 5 minutes is so long, and some of you are saying, wow, 5 minutes went by really fast. Some of you had a real challenge in being a neutral listener so that you gave all the space to your speaker. Some of you may have found that really comfortable and easy. Fabulous. So we're going to switch roles now. And again, this is challenging, I know. Let's see how much we can exercise this muscle of fully listening and fully having the luxury of just saying whatever you want, wherever you go is great. And so now we need the new speaker, used to be the listener, now the new speaker, tell your listener which one of these three you want. Okay, so at the start of the bell, we're going to start again. This time, because you're very experienced at this, take a few moments to have a few breaths, maybe 3 breaths together to really center yourself to see where you are, whether or not you have a breathing practice or not. It's a great way to ground yourself. And during it, once in a while, on your own, just stop and see how are you feeling. Listener, you have the opportunity to do that the whole time. Speaker, you can actually stop talking if you wish and do that as well. So I'm going to ring the chime again, and you'll have 5 minutes now in this configuration. Okay, take 1 minute and share in a normal conversational tone and animation with your partner about how that was for you, each. Okay. I'm going to interrupt you with great regret to interrupt you because this is great. There's a lot of animation here. And I'll just finish up before we start the Q&A by saying the reason that I find this exercise a really important one is because in so many cases over all these 24 years of breaking into new places, new ground, new ways to revolutionize things, it wasn't so much that I was smarter than somebody else or that I had a better idea. It really was about me being able to present myself in a way that I hoped would be heard and that I hope would be seen, and that I realized during those years that I really had to show up for others to do that. Over the last few years, I've begun to really concentrate on doing this with even more intention. But I think if every one of us recognizes that regardless of our age or what we've done or the category we gave ourselves at the beginning of this talk, that each of us is an expert in ourselves and in what it means to be a human being and how to live a life on this earth. And each of us shows up for someone else in that way, takes a breath when something challenges us or when we're afraid or when something feels off. I think we'll give ourselves more space and more time to actually see each other and to come to solutions and resolutions much more quickly in a world in which we desperately need it this day. I'm going to invite us to not only in the question and answer period to reflect on the kinds of things I did in my journey, but anything in your journey that resonated, because that's the most important thing to me, as well as anything in the exercise that was interesting or difficult, the experience you had both being quiet with someone else or not, and how that might have stirred some things in you and what you notice. So again, I thank you all so much for this opportunity to be with you. This is really an amazing experience for me. Thank you.
Okay, questions. That's going to be interesting, I think.
Anything.
Oh yeah. So let's see if we have any questions on the public. Who wants to start? Questions there? Yep. Yeah, you can go to the mic. Please give us your name, introduce yourself with your name, and then with your question.
My name is Wendy Harris, and I would say I didn't have the app or anything, so I couldn't do any of the poll questions. So I'm like a mix, parent, researcher, citizen science, everything. First of all, what resonated was the fear-based, not having the language, not understanding the concepts, of having absolutely zero background in a world, in this whole hidden world, and suddenly becoming one of them, like one of those people. Like, how do they do it? I don't know. My journey so far is with my youngest son to my middle son. My youngest son was diagnosed when he was 7 with mosaic trisomy 15 ring with a neocentromere, was the ectopic emergence of a new centromere, for those that don't know, which underneath that, you have that one diagnosis, and then what falls below that, developmental delay on the autism spectrum. But in that progress of entering this world and into this whole world of genes and chromosomes, was that I began exploring and understanding, and every bit of information was unlocking a whole host, because you have a one word packed with information that you needed like a year's worth of education. But what happened in that, interestingly enough, because again, this gave me a background in this world, in this language, is my middle son began developing psychosis 3 years ago. Right away, it was, is there something going on with his chromosomes, something going on genetically? And I started pushing for some testing. And what I was told straight away was, there's this big, huge wait list. This is going to take 2 years. And I said, well, no, put his brother's name on some of the material. It'll be done fast, which it was, because we've been involved in research. But one thing led to another, that as my middle son became sicker and sicker, and failing medication after medication, is that I was exploring even further and came across a gene family called the CYPs or CYPs, and found out that 30% of the population have polymorphic CYPs, which corresponded to what was happening with James. So again, I pushed, went to the doctors over and over and over again, and came across Robert Stowe, who's a neuro psychiatrist, who believed that I had something, might be onto something. So he was able to, some fanatic, working around, is to arrange a test, and sure enough, my middle son was polymorphic in these things. What that has led to is a big breakthrough in his medications and his treatment. They're bringing in a certain medication in from Europe, because it's not available in North America, because all of the medication that he had been given, his body can't metabolize it. So it's building up, and this creates a problem for people that do have these differences, because usually they don't find this out until they go into liver failure or die. So what this has happened for this guy is that he's about 90% back by this point, and doing quite well. I'm here, I wanted to hear your story in person, but I want to know how I can push even further with this. I think that everybody, with the one Dr. Stowe, is approaching this provincially because he wants to see everybody tested this way, especially people with refractory psychosis, just to be sure, because nothing would have helped James, and in fact made him sicker. So I want to know, you seem to be able to get through a lot of the blocks fairly quickly, and into the research part, and having that part funded, and would have taken a lot of money. And I'm just like to hear a little bit about that. Like, where can I take this now?
Yeah, great, thank you. And I completely resonate with your story, because it's the story of many, many of us moms and dads who and loved ones. So a couple things. One is, because I thought what I was doing should be accessible to others, I've written a wiki called wikiadvocacy.org, and it has 2,000 pages of stuff we did, and it's been added to by lots of other advocates, because while we established a biobank for just our disease, we quickly established one for all diseases, and we had a registry for our disease, and we established one for all diseases. So I think wiki advocacy would have a lot of good, rich stuff in it for you, and I can write that down later for you if you want. And then the other thing, I think, with regard to funding is an interesting thing. And some of the foundations and advocacy groups in the world have someone famous, and they get a lot of money from a famous person. Some of them have a researcher get very interested and apply for funding from a funding agency and work in partnership with the advocacy group. Some of them do bake sales and car washes one at a time, and that's what we did basically, is we just, we did wine tastings and beer tastings and triathlons and blah, blah, blah. So I think being creative about whatever will get small amounts of funding, and then most of the research that we've seen has been, we've seeded it like a small grant to a postdoc in a lab, who then the senior researcher really liked the project, liked our involvement, could easily enroll a quarter of the world's population with this particular disease, which is only 1,000 people, and was really excited by it. So I think finding those partnerships and the people who listen, like the guy you're talking about, make a big difference. And then I think go ahead and create registries and biobanks, because, as I said, they're the food that the cats want. We can do it easier than the researchers can do it, and we also can keep it from being siloed in separate labs. Those would be the kind of nuts and bolts. And email me if you have any more questions. Okay.
Let's try and make the question short, so that we have space for many people asking questions. Thank you. And introduce yourself with your name, please.
My name is Scott Pownall, and 3 weeks ago I was at the MIT Media Lab. I was a participant in the first global community Bio Summit, and is basically citizen scientists from around the world gathered for the first time to kind of, it was an amazing experience to be able to get people to engage. And these community labs are opening up all around the world. So we had people from Myanmar who were doing research in the jungles on the impact of development there. Likewise in Singapore, Pakistan, Africa, South America, Europe, North America, bringing all sorts of citizen science type efforts. How do you see that we can get the public, the people here, to engage in and supporting, not just for health, but also for the environment, which is a huge problem, to get them engaged in citizen science?
Great question. So I think one thing in the health arena, I would say, if we could each become personally interested in our health and how we connect to it. So and this will annoy the clinicians in the room, but I would say ask for your medical record, which is going to be a difficult thing to even get access to, because we all should be able to exchange that information and get it into registries so that we can be sharing information and doing this much faster. With regard to, and then I think the other way is about 4% of the US public participate in, 4% participate in clinical trials. Upping that for everybody is important, and I bet in Canada it's not much higher if it is higher. So figuring out ways to get into clinical trials, and I understand it's hard to find them, and you may not even have a disease, but healthy people, healthy controls are also an important piece of the puzzle. For the environment, what we've seen, and in the environment in some ways has had it much easier, because there are less concerns about privacy issues, which I could talk about, but I'm going to not at this moment. But it also, again, animating the public's interest in the fact that we are destroying the planet in many ways is a difficult thing. And the best efforts I've seen are very local, which I'd also say about health, by the way. I think we all get affinity to our neighborhood, to our community, to our group, and those affinities are what make us work together. And the grassroots kinds of things in communities that I've seen that have worked well are concern for the neighborhood and the ecosystem and the connectivity of, for example, grasses and trees and animals in the neighborhood has created citizen scientists. There are a couple apps now that allow people to track those things. Again, getting concerned groups together in neighborhoods, temples, churches, I think those are the ways to go, sports leagues, that sort of stuff, and going to those places rather than trying to set up a separate thing outside of them. My strong belief is we need to go where people live, work, and play and pray, and if we do, then we're going to be able to encourage research on everything more commonly.
Thank you for your wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Please send us all your questions online. I'm waiting here to see pop up some questions online, so if you're shy to take the mic, please send us your questions so we can ask the questions here.
Sharon, thank you for your inspiring talk. So I'm Victoria Xu from China, and we are a nonprofit to support innovation and startups by connecting them with Chinese resources. Operations here, both in Canada and in the States. So we've seen one poll about who owns the data, and a majority of people think that's ourselves. But then, that's conflict with the needs of the data sharing as you shared in your PXE story. So what's your view on that? That's general kind of public concern on this privacy that generates a challenge to the healthcare and genomic research.
Yeah, so often privacy is the reason given why we don't share more data. So medical institutions in the US, I know also in BC and other parts of Canada, will say we can't share data between our institutions or our systems or our different software pieces because of privacy. A couple things there. One, I think if we ask the people whose that data is, who own or that data came from, are you happy that that hospital is holding your data just for the scientists at that hospital to use? They would be pretty upset. I think if the public knew that we're hoarding data, so to speak, that would be a problem. I think we also see different tiers in population. So people who are sick always want to share data. The mothers and fathers of little children who have horrible conditions and are life-threatening will share the data easily. People with Alzheimer's, people with Parkinson's, and so on. People who have been stigmatized are less interested in sharing data or who have been discriminated against but by virtue of the data. So First Nations, Aboriginal, Indigenous peoples, Native Americans in the US, African Americans in the US trust less. And in those cases, I say we need to start to build in those communities the researchers, the leadership, and have it be born in the community. We can't helicopter in and make those decisions, which is why I would also say our hospitals and our researchers should not be making decisions for us either. The solution that I've created is just a startup, essentially a thing called the Platform for Engaging Everyone Responsibly, which lets people put their clinical information and their patient-reported outcomes into the platform and then make decisions about where it goes. Everywhere? Just to one research group, just to one geographic location, et cetera. And I think if we give people, just like we can manage our own money and move it around the way we want to, if we give people those kind of controls, then I think we're going to see more people be less concerned about those things. I also think we need to give people permission to be afraid and to want things to be private, because that's a valuable and viable place to be as well. And then the other thing I'll say is the little bit I've done in China. So I visited Beijing Children's Hospital as a visiting scholar, and actually I'm a visiting professor at Hebei University. I've been really impressed with some of the things that the Chinese people have been able to do. Some people look at it and say, oh, but they're all being made, for example, to sequence every baby that comes into the hospital. But on the other hand, what I saw when I talked to parents through translators, where they were very happy that this kind of cohesive work with a lot of people is being done, and I think we're going to see some real advances that BGI and others are encouraging.
Yeah, actually, I have a follow-up question on that. Is that in China, privacy is a less concern in general public. So, because your organization and your work is kind of global, I wanted your view on how probably China can play a bigger role and contribute more to this.
That's terrific. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good.
Maybe a follow-up before we go there on that. So data sharing, great. We are trying to open science, open data and all that. But give us maybe an example of a successful place, jurisdiction, region in the world maybe that you know, where it's not just about sharing the data, but integrating the data.
Yeah.
Because one thing is I can share my data, I can open my data, I did my 23andMe, it's open. I did my Understand Your Genome, is open. But what are we doing to integrate that data and really make meaningful analysis of that integrated data?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you know one very well, because Iceland, for example, where you worked, because the population's homogeneous in its thinking and values, and because the system was already integrated records that went back hundreds of years, that was easy. In places where those systems don't talk to each other, and that's true in BC, it's true in Canada, it's true in the US, there are some experiments. And so the experiments are, for example, I'm part of something called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute Network, and it allows institutions across the US, about 100 of them, so not all of them, to use something called a common data model. So I can still have my software from XYZ company and your software, but we have a common data model where we map those elements together. I think, just like the financial industry, when we broke down the silos in the banks and they all started to talk to each other, and Visa talked to MasterCard, and we can use either one, we're going to see the same thing in health if we have enough pressure from us, the public, to say we need these data shared. And then I've also seen this successful in some other countries that have broken down silos because they're small enough. I think in big, diverse populations like we have in North America, it's very hard to do that. And there's not a lot of incentive because the people who pay for healthcare is a very complicated system, doesn't give an incentive for that integration to happen. And then finally, I'll say we've seen it in certain different medical institutions that have put together systems. So, for example, a lot of Californians are in something called Kaiser Permanente, and it has integrated systems across hospitals. But I think there's still a really long way to go on that.
Hi. Okay. Hi, my name is Karima. I am a student. I also consider myself a researcher and a citizen scientist. I feel like I have food for cats. My partner has Crohn's disease, and it's Canada has one of the world's highest rated countries in incidences of Crohn's disease, and doctors and scientists still don't understand what causes it entirely or its cure. And I've made it the focus of my studies and have made some excellent progress when helping my partner and talking to other people who have it and managing it with lifestyle, diet, supplementation, and things like that. So I'm really excited about that. But what I would like to hear from you, please, because this is a really excellent talk, is when you're struggling and not sure which way is the right way to go next, what keeps you motivated and gives you direction? Thank you.
Thank you. A great question. One of the things that I have felt and experienced during this whole process is the fear of making the wrong decision, because enormous amounts of opportunity, possibility sort of rest on my shoulders. And now, not just all these years, not just for my kid's disease and all the people with that disease, but also all these other people who I now work toward and work for. I think I go back to coming back to myself in a kind of really grounded way of saying, all I can be is me, and me is enough, and me is going to make mistakes, and me is going to go the wrong direction sometimes. And I have been able to go forward even when I have indecision, certainly using all the tools we all figure out, about pros and con lists and conversations with supporters as part of why I use the support question in the exercise, like, well, how can I be supported in those moments of indecision? And then basically come back to saying, I'm going to make a choice, and I'm going to be in that choice and with that choice, knowing that I did the very best I could. That has really sustained me, and I haven't felt unmotivated at all in this process, even when I've made horrendous mistakes, and I have along the way, and things that I wish were different. But I also know spending time on that regret or wishing takes away energy from my moving forward. So find your core and stand your ground.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you so much.
Good.
Well, I think they removed my question. Oh, no, okay, they are back. So first one, I guess that's many people are thinking about that. Have you got a treatment for PX.
Yeah, so great question. On the one hand, I say when I'm in various situations, I'm a tweaker. I've only tweaked the system. I haven't done anything, and we've not been successful. 24 years later, there's no treatment. On the other hand, more to the point of probably the science question here, we never use the word cure. I don't believe we're going to cure most things. We use the word tame. So if we tame the disease, in our case, slow it down. You don't get blind until you're 30. What if you got blind at 60? What if you got blind at 90? That would be terrific. And the answer to this question is this year we have 4 trials that will be entering in phase 1 clinical trials. And one of them is very promising. One of them is, and in fact I can talk about it finally, a food additive that's in a lot of things like Philadelphia cream cheese and sausage and chocolate, a thing called pyrophosphate, that turns out is the thing that's lower in people's blood because the ABCC6 gene is the gene with mutations in it and has either nonsense or missense mutations. So it turns out that this is also another wonderful thing about science and about people and curiosity. That substance, pyrophosphate, is in all these foods we eat because it was declared not bioavailable 50 years ago. Can't be digested, don't worry about it. My researcher, who I've funded for millions of years, in 24 years in Hungary, decided he didn't like the way that research looked, and he drank some pyrophosphate, and his blood levels went up. And he gave it to everybody in his lab, and all their blood levels went up. So a kind of citizen science right in the lab, right? A kind of saying, don't trust the orthodoxy. Question always, ask questions all the time. And so we are putting that into a phase 1 clinical trial in January or February. We'll dose 20 people, we'll dose 20 controls, we'll look at their blood levels. Whether or not that will mitigate the disease, we don't know. We have fed it to mice, of course, our knockout mice, and our knockout mice do not develop PXE symptoms and signs based on, I guess you'd say signs because they don't have symptoms, but signs based on that. And now we're gone on to do the same experiments in rats. So this seems super promising to us, and we're going to pursue that this year. It brings its own challenges. When we take a food additive and make it now a drug, I am sure the FDA is going to, I probably don't want to release this recording, they're going to freak out. And the other thing will be, we're going to have to get a drug company involved. And can we get a drug company involved who will not take this stuff that you can buy for $100 for a tractor-trailer truckload and make it cost $500,000 a year to drink this stuff. So we're going to have a lot of negotiation here, and it'll be another place that I bet I will be hacking my way through the rainforest by ourselves in some cases, and with others around us who will be hopefully cheering for us that at the end of the day this stuff costs $50 a month or something like that. So yeah, so there is a potential for a treatment in the next probably 4 or 5 years because it takes a long time to go through this process.
But would that mean that if that works and this trial is successful and all that, that in the future when a baby is born and has that mutation, we give them that supplement immediately, they will never develop the symptoms. And they will avoid the, as we call them always, the diagnostic odyssey of going years and years and years and all the stress of the parents on what is this going. So is that...
Yeah, and as you know, Catalina, it means a couple things. It means we are newborn screening for even adult onset diseases, because this is adult onset. Yes, then we dose the kids right away and they don't develop the disease. And the other thing I should say is, and we can't forget the people who did have progressive disease and have lost their vision and their skin is in horrible shape and their arteries are bad. And we actually have another project where we're looking at macrophages and seeing whether or not they can eat the tissue and regenerate a better, cleaner tissue.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, that's very promising.
Yeah.
The other question we had before we go, we go there. And that's a question I think that, again, many people are asking. We have all these great developments now, genome sequencing, all these technologies, but most of those technologies are only available in certain countries for certain people that can pay for that. So what, and we were discussing actually yesterday of this Facebook presentation that Francis Collins did together with Bill Gates, exactly, on trying to bring genomics more on the global health. So what's your perspective on that? Are we going to be able to bring that to the world and to global health issues? Or is it still going to be genomics only for the rich or for the countries where, more developed countries and all that?
Yeah, so this troubles me a lot too. And even since the beginning of my work in this, I've been saying, how can we actually use genomics, genetics to behave differently than other technologies, not follow that same path where the rich will get it and the poor won't, where developing nations won't have it. So I think we have a few experiments in this regard. One is certainly how do we drive the price overall down. I mean, I forgot what the price tag was, $3 billion 30 years ago, and now it's $1,000 for a genome. So that kind of driving it down will be important. The other part for me is looking at, I'm part of several global groups. So Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, meeting in Orlando this week, the International Rare Disease Research Consortium. And in both of those cases, we're working with countries from all around the world and seeing what do you need in Africa and South America, parts of Asia, and even parts of Eastern Europe to be able to access these technologies so we don't create that disparity. And I think inherent in the question is also the reliability of the data if we don't have the people of the planet represented. If we just have certain segments of the planet people represented, is it reliable data? Is it useful for other populations? And I think the answer to that is no. We really do need to get deep sequencing on lots of people. I'm heartened by projects where the US, for example, is supporting Africa in a project called H3 Africa and encouraging, again, not to helicopter in and sequence all the people and take away their DNA, but instead to build a scientific leadership in countries in Africa so that the work can be done in Africa for people in Africa. And then I look at things like the Bill Gates Foundation and say, they get it that we can't be just doing infectious disease. We also need to be looking at genomic technologies and what those could do to prevent disease in other parts of the world. So I see some signs of promise, and I think we're at least asking the question early and not waiting for us to have a big stratification of the haves and the have-nots.
One interesting example also that I can think of is Thailand, where they're implementing pharmacogenomics. And they're not doing whole genome, they're not sequencing the entire population, but they're changing the healthcare system by testing a small panel of variants and acting on how they prescribe medications, saving costs. So there are some countries that maybe are not able to implement it at full scale, but they have ways of scaling up, small, step by step, and doing some small examples where they really have a big impact. Maybe we go for a question there, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Razvan. I'm a career researcher. I've been doing research for more than 10 years now. And I wanted to say that what you said in the beginning of your talk really resonated with me, because one of my biggest disappointments very early on in my career actually was realizing how few of my peers entered the field with the scope of helping mankind. It seemed more a tool to feed their own curiosity than anything else. So I really do enjoy the idea of opening up data and making it public and putting it in the public domain. And you may be aware that there's big movements in academia now to move towards more open publications and take down the paywalls and so on. But also as a researcher, I have to say there are some concerns behind that, and they're possibly well-founded, because opening up data has inherent dangers, especially for early career researchers who run the risk of losing out to much more better founded labs and so on. And, the recent patent dispute about CRISPR comes to mind. So I wanted to ask, how do you ensure that there are no unscrupulous people who can take the data once it's in the open domain and then quickly shut the door and lock people out? Yeah,
great question. So I think the systems that we build, and I think the people building them are thinking about these things. So again, the Global Alliance and some ENCODE and some of the other big projects that are trying to share data are looking at how do we make sure that you can't take it and lock it up, because it remains. You can take a copy of it and lock it up, and that's fine. When we have done hard looks at open data and the misuse of that data for several reasons. One is it's hoarded and locked up somewhere else, or it's misused in the sense of trying to prove something that is unscrupulous. We haven't been able to find any hardcore cases, and that isn't just me. It's the National Academies of Medicine when they did this year-long project that I was part of and wrote a report on it. So I think we're probably a little too worried about things that probably won't happen. I do, however, totally understand that especially young investigators could be at a disadvantage. But here's how I would say we should change the system. And that is, let's move all of this data, the commodity, to a pre-competitive space where everyone can have at it, very much like astronomy, the semiconductor industry, and others have done, and then do the kind of valued things in the space after that. So in other words, if the genomic data and the clinical data is available to everyone, and if we have enough problems, and I do believe we have enough problems for the number of researchers we have, then we will be feeding off of each other instead of feeding on each other, in the sense of being able to share insight and accelerate discoveries and build on those. Now, do I also think that there will be harm in the process of moving from here to here? Yes. That's part of why I said I'm asking researchers to risk a lot, and that I need to think about how is it that I'm supporting that risk or not? How am I risking myself? But I think each of us have to say, if we sit here right now and think that if suddenly the floodgates of information opened at this moment, like we're going to go out in the hall and there will have been this major announcement that everything is open in terms of clinical and genomic information, won't we have accelerated the solutions we need? And what if we had done that 10 years ago or 20 years ago? One of my favorite sayings is, the best time was 20 years ago. This is the second best time. So can we do that kind of risky thinking, scramble up the business models, find the new business models, and somehow mitigate some of the harm that will happen in between? I know that will be hard for young investigators, but I also hear from young investigators, I can't get a major grant anyway until I'm 45. I'm going to need a different way of doing work than my mentor did because the same path is not open to me. So I hear a lot of them trying to find ways actually to share data and get access to it.
We're going to this shortly into this final question, and I think is actually is a very good question, a very interesting question, because that goes back to exactly what we were thinking when Sally and I were trying to think, who's our next DRDK? Is it a scientist again? Is somebody that can speak about genomics again? Or let's think about maybe potentially somebody that can talk about all of us in the science. And I think that's our final question for today. So what can we do as regular citizens to really put some pressure on policymakers to share medical data?
Yeah,
so we have discussed that on the round tables, and
yes.
I think is a great closing question.
Yeah, great question. So this is probably the premier question of this space. The remarkable thing when you have this conversation with policymakers is they say, we want to open the data, but we can't for these reasons. And you have the conversation with researchers, and they say, we want to share the data, but we can't for these reasons. So what I think as an ordinary citizen is we can escalate the conversation, because we're in this room here in a kind of rarefied space. Most of the rest of the world doesn't really understand the connection between my sharing my data and a solution for my loved one who has a disease tomorrow. When they get that diagnosis, there's no treatment, and there isn't because we haven't shared. The other part for me that's really important is understanding how can I put pressure on a system that then would rise to the level of the policymakers hearing it. And I think it is things as simple as the next time you go to the doctor saying, could I have my copy of my medical record? Now, sometimes they're going to tell you that's 14 feet tall and it costs you $600. We are going to have to keep asking that question until we get a good answer that's a reasonable one for us. Some electronic health systems work really well, some don't. That's going to be important for us to do. And then I think if we get to places where we do have a disease, we need to ask the people that are working on that disease, are you sharing data with others? We need to keep bringing that topic up. And then finally, I think there are some openings, and certainly groups like Genome BC, boy, my brain is like...
It's been a long day.
Yeah, these guys keep me going, are really thinking about this in meaningful ways. And so when opportunity comes for these policymakers to hear from the public, or when there's an opportunity to convene them like they're doing, then being vocal, writing letters, writing articles in the newspaper, all that sort of stuff I think makes a difference. Because policymakers care about what you think, obviously. And when they're running for office, even in a really local way, asking them, what are you doing about helping to open data, helping to encourage research, what's your support for research, then it elevates the conversation, and I think we can make a difference that way. And then it goes all the way to extreme activism, where go and visit your representative and sit down with them and explain to them why this is important. Because sometimes it's as simple as they haven't heard about this and they need to hear about it from you, from your clinician, from the researchers, from your children, from your parents. Again, just sort of one-on-one. One of the things, and I'll finish with this, that we talked about in the roundtables that I've been doing over the last few days with policymakers and researchers and community organizers, et cetera, is that a lot of this, all of this, in my opinion, is relational. We always want to just make it transactional and have it be easy and done with. And I think it is relational. And the idea for me that every single one of us makes a difference is really true, even in the policy realm, that policy maker is hungry to hear what's really important, what's relevant, and probably hasn't connected some dots that you could help them connect. And even scientists, I know scientists have a real hard time becoming activists in that way or going to visit a policymaker. But you, in some ways, have even more clout because they'll really respect your opinion on this. And while you think you're just doing science, you're actually impacting policy in a big way by how you work, how you behave, how you do what you do. So I think each one of us has a responsibility there.
Well, that's a great ending. I think science is not about the lab, it's not about the scientists, it's about all of us. And advancing the implementation of precision medicine and genomics is not about the science, it's not about Genome BC only, it's about all of us. So thank you again. Thank you, Sharon, so much. Has been great, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have now John Shepherd that will give a final word, a final thanks.
Okay.
It's not finished.
Okay.
Stay there.
All right.
Thank you. My name is John Shepherd. I'm a member of the board of Genome BC, and I would just like to formally offer our thanks to Sharon for an inspiring talk today. I think that most of us, from the questions, will certainly be going away with a lot of new thoughts and new things to think about, whether we are clinicians, researchers, or citizen scientists, or those who would like to become citizen scientists. Sharon, I particularly took away a couple of your comments, which I think were really interesting. Obviously, how you took your fear and put that into action, I think, is something which is really, really important in the development of advocacy networks of all kinds. I appreciated the way you shared your thoughts about your inner and your outer self and how those were somewhat interchangeable in terms of dealing with things. And it brought to mind very much the oft-quoted comment of Margaret Mead's about a small group of people changing the world, which I think you've demonstrated. And finally, I had two thoughts. Firstly, I would not want to be the pharmaceutical executive who comes up against you on the cost of pyrophosphate. And then lastly, in that sense, I was thinking of Don Rix, whom I actually had the pleasure of knowing for more than 50 years. He was a close family friend and personal friend of my father's. And I think that Don, who was a very, very businesslike and very innovative person, as Pascal said, would be absolutely delighted to know at the kind of thing that you have done today and to have been here were he able to do so. So on behalf of Genome BC, Catalina and I have a gift for you for sharing with your time and so on. We will arrange, Sally will come back to this, to have this shipped to you because there's no way you're taking it on your carry-on luggage. This is a talking stick, and for those of you who may not be familiar with it, a talking stick is something which is very representative of First Nations democracy. It's used by many First Nations bands throughout North America, but particularly in the Pacific Northwest. And the talking stick is passed around amongst a group of individuals and allows them to present their views without interruption, which is interesting, coming back to the Gestalt exercise that you did with us today. This talking stick is engraved with three animals: an eagle, which is a symbol of power, knowledge, and prestige; a wolf, and wolves, as some of you probably know, are extremely family-oriented and have a very, very tight social network, which is important for the kind of research you've talked about; a whale, which is known as a communicator and highly regarded guardian of the sea; and a raven, which those of us who live in British Columbia know is a symbol of knowledge. So we hope that this will serve as a reminder of your trip to Vancouver this time and to Genome BC, and thank you for that. So.
Wow. Thank you. gosh.
We're supposed to hang together for pictures.
Yes, yes. Oh my gosh. Wow.
Thank you. So before we close up the formal program, I'd just like to acknowledge a few people. Pascal Spot-Helfer for bringing us together, and actually Isabel, his wife, whom I had never met before today, but whom I felt totally comfortable sharing my innermost feelings with. A violation of everything they teach you in medical school, I got to tell you, as well as Catalina and Sally Greenwood for bringing Sharon's visit together. I'd also like to thank Sally's communications team, and particularly Catherine Monker, Cis Mikado, Jenny Boone, Kate Harlan, Brad Lyle, and Damian Lee, who have been instrumental in putting together not only this talk tonight, but as you have heard from Sharon and Catalina, the somewhat exhausting schedule of engagements that we've put Sharon through in the last couple of days. So this concludes the keynote portion of the program, and we would encourage you to continue discussions outside. We have some light snacks and refreshments, and if you can buttonhole Sharon, I'm sure she would probably be willing to answer a couple more of questions quietly. So again, thank you all for attending, and Sharon, thank you so much for your presentation.